on a night when the wind had teeth. What would you do if a starving woman slipped into the smokehouse, offered her life and service, and met your eyes with defiance? Turn her into the storm or open your door and risk the fortress you swore never to breach alone? The wind had teeth that night. It gnawed at the log walls of my cabin, seeking out the smallest chinks in the daubing I'd spent a decade maintaining. Outside, the world had been bleached of all color, buried under a week of relentless snow that had fallen so thick and fast it seemed the sky itself was collapsing. I reckoned it was nearly 4 feet deep on the level ground, deeper in the drifts that curled like frozen waves against the north side of the barn. It was a cold that didn't just bite. It consumed. It seeped into the bones and settled there, a permanent resident in the marrow. My name is Silas, and for 15 years this small patch of unforgiving land had been my only companion. I'd come here after Martha passed, seeking a silence loud enough to drown out the echoes of a life that was no longer mine. The world of men with its empty chatter and hollow sympathies held nothing for me. Here the only conversations were with the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. And they were honest conversations, speaking of survival and solitude, the only two truths I had left. That evening the fire was roaring in the stone hearth, a defiant beast of orange and gold clawing against the oppressive dark. I sat at my table, running a whetstone along the edge of my skinning knife, the rhythmic scrape of familiar comfort in the crushing quiet. The shelves behind me were lined with jars of beans and corn, Martha's legacy of foresight. The meat hooks in the smokehouse held 2 deer and a handful of rabbits, my own provision against the long, cruel winter. I was a man who planned, a man who left nothing to chance. I had built my life like a fortress against the unpredictable cruelties of the world. It was the stillness that alerted me, not a sound but the absence of one. The wind had died down for a moment, and in that vacuum I felt a shift, a subtle disturbance in the order of my world. It was a feeling I hadn't had since the last time a grizzly had nosed around the smokehouse 2 winters back. I set the knife down, my hand resting on the smooth, worn wood of the handle. My rifle, a Winchester .20-73, leaned against the wall by the door, always within reach. I didn't grab it. Not yet. First you listen, then you act. That was the law of the wilderness. I sat motionless, my senses straining against the silence. And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic scraping from the direction of the smokehouse. It wasn't an animal. An animal would be clumsy, frantic. This was careful, deliberate, human. A cold dread sharper than the winter air coiled in my gut. No one came this far into the mountains, especially not in this weather. The trail was impassable to all but the most desperate or the most foolish. Whoever was out there was trespassing on more than just my land. They were trespassing on my solitude, the one thing I guarded more fiercely than my life. I rose from my chair, my movements slow, and measured the floorboards, groaning softly under my weight. I pulled on my heavy sheepskin coat and my boots, my mind a cold, clear slate. I didn't light a lantern. The moon was nearly full, and its stark silver light reflecting off the snow was bright enough to see by. It painted the world in shades of white and black, a landscape of ghosts. Stepping outside was like walking into the heart of a glacier. The air was so cold it burned my lungs, each breath a painful crystalline thing. The snow crunched under my boots, the only sound in the frozen world. The smokehouse stood about 30 yards from the cabin, a small windowless structure of rough-hewn logs. The scraping had stopped. Whoever was in there knew I was coming. My hand went to the heavy iron latch on the door. It was cold enough to steal the heat from my fingertips, even through my gloves. For a moment I hesitated. My life was a fragile, carefully constructed thing, a routine of chores, meals, and silence. This was a stone thrown into the still pool of my existence. But turning back was not in my nature. I had never backed down from a fight, be it with man, beast, or the elements. I lifted the latch and pulled the heavy door open. The smell of cured meat and cold smoke hit me first. The interior was dark, but a sliver of moonlight from the open door cut through the gloom. It fell upon a figure huddled in the far corner, small and hunched, surrounded by the hanging carcasses of the deer I'd hunted. A person so thin they looked like a bundle of rags and bones. As my eyes adjusted, I saw it was a woman. Her hair was a long, tangled mess of black, streaked with snow. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp as flint under skin stretched taut and bruised by the cold. She was wearing a tattered garment that might have once been a dress, now offering no more protection than a shroud. Her feet were wrapped in rags, a pathetic defense against the frostbite that had surely already claimed them. In her lap, she clutched a side of venison, holding it to her chest like a lost child. Her knuckles were white, her arms trembling, but her eyes were what stopped me. They were wide and dark, and in their depths I saw a fear so profound, it was almost a physical thing. But beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something else. Defiance. The stubborn, desperate ember of a life that refused to be extinguished. I stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the snow-bright night, my shadow falling over her. The cold air swirled around us. I didn't speak. I just watched her, my heart a hard, slow drum against my ribs. People were trouble. They brought with them chaos, need, and pain. I had built this life to be free of all that. She must have seen the judgment in my face, the hard line of my jaw. The venison slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud on the dirt floor. Slowly, as if every movement was an agony, she raised her hands, palms open. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, broken rasp, the sound of leaves skittering across frozen ground. "Don't kill me," she whispered, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Her eyes held mine, and the raw plea in them was a blow harder than any fist. Then she said the words that would unravel the quiet tapestry of my life. "I can serve you, if you spare my life." The words hung in the frozen air between us, an offering born of absolute desperation. Serve me. I knew what she meant. It was the last currency a woman in her position had. She was offering her body in exchange for a few more breaths in a world that had clearly shown her no mercy. A bitter, acidic taste rose in my throat. I had seen the ugliness of men, the way they preyed on the weak. I had left that world behind, but here it was, its stench following me even into my frozen sanctuary. My first instinct was to say no, to tell her to get out, to vanish back into the snow that had spawned her. It was the safe thing, the simple thing. Her fate was not my concern. I had enough ghosts to contend with. I didn't need a living one. I took a step into the smokehouse, the door swinging slightly behind me, casting her face in and out of shadow. I saw the bruises on her arms, the raw, chapped skin of her lips. This woman hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks. She had been living on the ragged edge of survival, and the fall was coming fast. I looked at her huddled on the floor, and I didn't see a thief. I saw the reflection of my own solitude. I was starving too, not for food, but for something I couldn't name. A warmth that had nothing to do with a fire. The silence in my cabin wasn't peace. It was an ache. A hollow space that had grown larger with each passing year. What kind of man would I be to send her back out into that killing cold? Martha would have never forgiven me. The memory of her kindness, was a sudden sharp pain in my chest. She had been the one to teach me that a man's strength wasn't in his fists, but in his compassion. I had forgotten that lesson. My jaw tightened. I gave a single curt nod. My voice was rough from disuse, lower than I intended. "Drop the rest. Come inside." She didn't move. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dark, searched my face, looking for the trick, the lie. I could see the battle raging within her. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but the alternative was a slow, freezing death. Now I set my tone, leaving no room for argument. Slowly, she uncurled her fingers from a small piece of jerky she had palmed. It fell to the floor. With a great effort, she pushed herself to her feet, swaying her body so weak I thought she might collapse. She took a hesitant step toward me, then another. Her ragged breathing was loud in the small space. I turned and walked back to the cabin, not looking back to see if she was following. If she wanted to live, she would come. The snow crunched under my boots, a lonely rhythmic sound, but this time it was followed by another softer sound. The shuffling of her rag-bound feet, a desperate echo of my own. A knot of something I couldn't identify tightened in my chest. I had just invited the world back into my life, and I had no idea if I would survive it. The cabin door creaked open, spilling a warm yellow light onto the snow. She paused on the threshold, a wild creature hesitating at the entrance of a trap. Her eyes darted around the single room, taking in my life. In a single sweeping glance, the bed in the corner with its thick wool blankets, the rifle by the door, the shelves of provisions, the fire blazing in the hearth, everything neat, ordered, solitary. I closed the door behind her, shutting out the wind and the cold. The sudden silence was heavy, charged with uncertainty. She stood just inside the door, hugging her thin arms to her chest, trembling, whether from cold or fear I couldn't tell. Probably both. She looked breakable, a thing of sticks and shadows, and yet she had survived a trek that would have killed a lesser person. I didn't speak. Words were clumsy things and I was out of practice. Instead, I moved to the hearth where a pot of stew was simmering. The smell of venison root vegetables and herbs filled the room. I ladled a generous portion into a wooden bowl, tore off a hunk of dark bread from the loaf on the mantel and set them on the table. I pulled out a chair for her, the scrape of its legs against the floorboards loud in the quiet room. She watched my every move, her body coiled like a spring. When I gestured to the chair, she approached it cautiously, as if expecting the floor to give way beneath her. She sank onto the seat, her eyes fixed on the steaming bowl. For a long moment, she just stared at it, her hands clenched in her lap. The raw, desperate hunger in her eyes was painful to watch. "Eat," I said, my voice softer this time. That one word seemed to break the spell. Her hands, shaking violently, reached for the spoon. She ate with a frantic, desperate haste, scooping the stew into her mouth, barely chewing. She kept glancing up at me between bites, her eyes wide and wary, as if she expected me to snatch the bowl away at any moment. I leaned back against the far wall, my arms crossed over my chest, giving her space. I watched her not with judgment, but with a kind of detached curiosity. I was a man who observed things. I knew the habits of deer, the flight patterns of eagles, the subtle signs of a coming storm. Now I was learning the habits of a starving woman. I saw the way the warmth of the food slowly unclenched the muscles in her shoulders. I saw the tremor in her hands begin to subside. I saw the life faint as it was begin to seep back into her face. She ate until the bowl was empty, then used the bread to wipe up every last drop of gravy, a thoroughness born of profound want. When she was done, she pushed the bowl away and finally looked at me. The fear was still there, but it was banked now like embers under a layer of ash. She was assessing me, trying to understand the man who had caught her stealing and then fed her at his table. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were barely audible. I gave a curt nod. I filled a tin cup with water from the bucket by the door and set it in front of her. She drank it down in one long draught, her throat working. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with unspoken questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? What horrors had driven her to my door in the middle of a blizzard? I didn't ask. I had learned long ago that some stories are too heavy to be pulled from a person. They have to be offered. I looked at the bruises peeking out from the torn sleeve of her dress, the gaunt hollows of her cheeks. She was a woman who carried a world of pain. Forcing her to speak of it would be another kind of violence. But the practicalities of the situation couldn't be ignored. What was I to do with her? The snow showed no signs of stopping. To turn her out now would be a death sentence, no different than putting a bullet in her head. But to keep her here, it was a complication I didn't want. My life was a simple, brutal equation: work, eat, sleep, survive. She was an unknown variable, and she could change the entire result. She seemed to read my thoughts. Her shoulders slumped and a look of resignation settled over her features. She had made her bargain. Now she was waiting for me to collect. "The floor," I said, gesturing toward the hearth. "By the fire." I took the spare blanket from the foot of my bed, a thick, heavy wool thing, and tossed it onto the floorboards in the warmest spot. Her eyes followed the blanket, then flicked to my face. I saw confusion in them then, a flicker of something that might have been relief. It was a small gesture, but it was a clear one. I was not a man who would force a woman to her knees no matter what she had offered in her desperation. She slid off the chair and went to the blanket, curling up on it, pulling it tight around her thin frame. She turned her back to me, facing the fire, a small wounded animal seeking warmth. The firelight danced on her tangled hair, turning it from black to a deep shimmering red. I remained in my chair, watching the flames, my mind a turmoil of conflicting thoughts. For the first time in 15 years, I was not alone. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker, charged with her presence. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sound of her breathing. It was an intrusion, a disruption of the highest order. And yet as I sat there in the long hours of the night, listening to the wind howl its lonely song outside, a strange, unwelcome thought began to form in my mind. For the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a cage. And a stranger, a thief with haunted eyes, had just walked through the door. Dawn came not as a sunrise, but as a subtle lessening of the oppressive dark. A reluctant shift from black to a bruised, sullen gray. The wind had finally quieted, leaving behind a world muffled and still under its thick blanket of snow. I hadn't slept. I had sat in my chair all night, my rifle across my lap, watching the fire die down to glowing embers and listening to the soft, even rhythm of the woman's breathing. It was a vigil, though I wasn't sure what I was guarding against, her or myself. I rose as the first light touched the single window pane, my muscles stiff and cold. My gaze went immediately to the hearth. She was still curled under the blanket, a small mound in the semi-darkness. She looked even more fragile in the pale morning light, younger than I had first thought. The harsh lines of hunger and fear were softened in sleep, and for a moment I saw the face of a woman, not just a survivor. My movement stirred her. Her eyes snapped open, and for a terrifying second they were wide with a primal animalistic fear. The look of a cornered creature. Then recognition dawned and the fear receded, replaced by the same cautious, wary expression she had worn the night before. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her like a shield. "I'll fetch water," I said, my voice a low growl in the quiet cabin. It was an excuse to get out to breathe air that wasn't thick with her presence, to restore the familiar order of my morning routine. Outside, the cold was a physical blow. The world was a masterpiece of white, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes and drifts. The path to the well was gone, buried. It would take me half the morning to clear it. For now, I would have to melt snow. I scooped a bucket full of clean, powdery snow from a drift by the door and carried it back inside. She was on her feet when I returned, standing uncertainly by the hearth. She had folded the blanket with a neatness that surprised me. The small act spoke of a life that had once known discipline and order. I set the bucket of snow on the hearth to melt and began preparing breakfast. I sliced salt pork into a skillet, the sizzle and pop of it loud in the cabin. The smell of frying meat was a welcome, familiar thing. I didn't speak to her, and she didn't speak to me. An unspoken agreement of silence seemed to have been forged between us. It was a language we both understood. I expected her to sit and wait, to be a passive recipient of my charity. Instead, she hesitated for a moment, then picked up the small broom from the corner and began to sweep the hearth. Her movements were slow, almost tentative at first, but they were deliberate. She swept the stray ashes and wood chips into a neat pile, her focus entirely on the simple task. I watched her out of the corner of my eye as I cooked. It was a small act, this sweeping, but it was significant. It was not the action of a servant waiting for orders. It was the action of someone trying to claim a small piece of dignity, to contribute rather than just take. A flicker of respect ignited within me. This woman, whoever she was, had pride. When the pork was cooked and the coffee boiled, I served it onto 2 tin plates. We ate at the table, sitting across from each other. She ate slower this morning, the frantic edge of her hunger dulled. She still didn't meet my eyes, keeping her gaze fixed on her plate. But the tension in her shoulders had lessened. She was no longer a cornered animal, but a wary guest. After breakfast, the day's work began. The most urgent task was to clear a path. A man could be buried alive in his own home in this kind of weather. I pulled on my coat and took the heavy shovel from its hook by the door. "Stay inside. Keep the fire fed," I ordered. I expected her to nod and obey. Instead, she looked at my coat, then at her own tattered dress. A silent, eloquent statement. She would freeze in minutes out there. I hesitated, a war raging within me. The part of me that craved solitude and simplicity wanted her to stay put, to remain a passive, manageable problem. But the part of me that respected her small act of sweeping, that saw the defiant spark in her eyes, knew that she needed more. To be idle is to be a prisoner. With a sigh that clouded in the cold air, I went to my trunk at the foot of the bed. I pulled out a set of Martha's old winter clothes, a heavy wool tunic, thick trousers, and a pair of fur-lined boots. They had been stored away for 15 years, smelling faintly of cedar and sorrow. I hadn't looked at them since the day I packed them. I placed them on the table without a word. "They'll be too big," I said gruffly. "But they're warm." She stared at the clothes, her eyes wide. She touched the soft wool of the tunic, her fingers tracing the worn fabric. For the first time, I saw her composure crack. Her lower lip trembled and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She looked up at me, and in that look I saw a gratitude so profound it made me deeply uncomfortable. I was not a man who dealt in emotions. I turned away, grabbing my shovel. "I'll be outside," I muttered, and fled the cabin. I worked for hours in the biting cold, my breath pluming, my muscles burning. The snow was heavy and the work was brutal. I shoveled a path to the well, then to the smokehouse, and finally to the barn. My world was reduced to the scrape of metal on snow, the ache in my back, and the rhythmic pattern of my breathing. It was familiar grounding work. When I finally returned to the cabin exhausted and covered in snow, I found a transformation had taken place. The woman, she was no longer a bundle of rags. She wore Martha's clothes. They were loose on her thin frame as I knew they would be, but they were clean and warm. She had washed her face and hands and tied back her tangled hair with a strip of leather. The cabin was warmer than when I'd left it. The fire was roaring and a pot of melted snow was steaming on the hearth. She had taken the stew I'd cooked for supper and added more vegetables from my stores, and the rich smell of it filled the air. She had not been idle. She had not waited to be told. She had seen what needed to be done and she had done it. She stood by the fire, stirring the pot her back to me. When she turned, she held a steaming cup in her hands. She offered it to me. It was coffee, black and strong, just the way I liked it. I took the cup, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. Her skin was cold, but there was a warmth that seemed to radiate from her. I looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. The dirt and desperation were gone, and in their place was a woman with a quiet strength that was both unnerving and compelling. Her face was still too thin. Her eyes still held a deep, lingering sadness, but the raw fear was gone. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice quiet but clear. I nodded, taking a sip of the hot coffee. The warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the bone-deep chill. "Silas," I replied. It was a simple exchange, just two names spoken into the quiet of the cabin. But it was a beginning, a shift from the anonymous roles of captor and captive, of savior and survivor, to something else, something more complicated, something human. That night, as the snow began to fall again, we sat in a shared silence that was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of two names, two pasts, and an uncertain future. And for the first time, the thought of that future didn't fill me with dread. It filled me with a quiet, terrifying curiosity. The days that followed settled into a strange, unspoken rhythm. The snow kept us prisoners, the world outside, a vast white wasteland. Inside the cabin, a fragile domesticity began to take root. We moved around each other with a careful, quiet grace, two solitary creatures learning to share a single small space. Alara was a tireless worker. She rose before me each morning, her movements soft, so as not to wake me. She would have the fire going and coffee brewing by the time I stirred. She mended my clothes with a skill that spoke of long practice, her small, neat stitches, a stark contrast to my own clumsy repairs. She cooked, cleaned, and organized my meager belongings with a quiet efficiency that both impressed and unsettled me. She was transforming my rough, solitary camp into a home, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. We rarely spoke. Words seemed unnecessary and perhaps too dangerous. Our communication was in actions. When I went out to chop wood, she would follow, gathering the smaller pieces and stacking them neatly by the door. When I checked my trap lines, she would have a hot meal waiting for me upon my return. I, in turn, made sure she ate first. I gave her the thicker of the two blankets for her bed on the hearth. They were small, silent acknowledgments, a language of mutual survival. But beneath the surface of this quiet routine, a current of tension ran deep. I was acutely aware of her presence, of her femininity. In the evenings when we sat by the fire, the light would catch the curve of her cheek or the line of her throat, and a feeling long dormant and unwelcome would stir within me. I was a man who had been alone for a long time. I had forgotten the simple, powerful presence of a woman in a room. I would watch her as she worked, her hands now clean and healing, moving with a delicate precision. I saw the strength in her slender frame, the resilience that had carried her through unimaginable hardships. She was not the broken thing I had first found. She was a woman of immense strength, and I found myself respecting her, even admiring her. This admiration was a dangerous thing. It chipped away at the walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart. It made me feel things I did not want to feel. I fought it. I kept my voice gruff, my expression stern. I maintained a physical distance between us, a no man's land of floorboards and silence. One afternoon, a week into her stay, the fragile peace was shattered. I was outside splitting logs for the fire. The work was hard, the axe heavy. I was lost in the rhythm of it, the swing and the satisfying crack of wood. I grew careless. On a downswing, the axe head glanced off a knot in the wood, skidding sideways and slicing deep into my left forearm. The pain was a sharp, blinding flash of white. I dropped the axe, cursing under my breath. Blood welled up instantly, a shocking, vibrant red against the white snow. It soaked my shirt sleeve in seconds. I pressed my right hand against the wound, a sick, dizzying feeling washing over me. Ilara must have heard the sound or my cry. The cabin door flew open and she was there, her face a mask of alarm. She took in the scene in an instant, the axe in the snow, my stance, the blood. She didn't hesitate. She ran to me, her boots sinking in the snow. "Let me see," she commanded, her voice firm, stripped of its usual timidity. "It's nothing," I grunted, my pride warring with the pain. She ignored me. She took my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and peeled back the bloody fabric. The gash was long and deep. I had cut myself before many times, but this was bad. "Inside." "Now," she ordered. She half led, half dragged me back to the cabin. She sat me in a chair by the fire, then went to work with a calm, focused intensity that stunned me. She stoked the fire, put a pot of water on to boil, and ripped a long, clean strip from one of my spare shirts. She was no longer the timid, fearful woman I had found in my smokehouse. She was a healer, a protector. She cleaned the wound with the hot water, her touch gentle but firm. I winced, my jaw clenched, the muscles in my neck cording. Her proximity was unnerving. Her face was close to mine, her brow furrowed in concentration. I could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair, the wood smoke that clung to her clothes. As she wrapped the bandage tightly around my arm, her fingers worked with a practiced skill. She had done this before. This was not the first wound she had tended. The thought sent a chill through me. What kind of life had she lived that had taught her such things? When she was finished, she tied the bandage off her hands, lingering on my arm for a moment. She looked up at me, her dark eyes searching mine. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the sound of our breathing. In that moment, the distance I had so carefully maintained between us vanished. We were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance. We were a man and a woman connected by an act of violence and an act of healing. "You'll need to rest it," she said, her voice soft again. "I will manage the wood." I just nodded, unable to speak. I watched her as she moved about the cabin, her familiar grace now imbued with a new authority. She had saved me from a serious injury, possibly from bleeding to death out in the snow. She had paid back her debt, the meal I had given her 100 times over. That night, the tension in the cabin was different. It was no longer a current of unspoken awareness, but a thick, palpable thing. I sat in my chair, my arm throbbing, watching her as she sat on her blanket by the fire. The silence between us was no longer a shield. It was a question. She had proven herself not as a servant, but as a partner. She had earned her place here not through begging, but through strength and competence. The roles had shifted. I was no longer just her protector. In a very real way, she was now mine as well. The thought was profoundly unsettling. For 15 years, I had relied on no one but myself. I had prided myself on my self-sufficiency, my independence. But as I looked at Ilara, her face soft and thoughtful in the firelight, I was forced to admit a difficult truth. I was no longer entirely alone. And the most terrifying part was, I was not sure I wanted to be. The fortress of my solitude had been breached not by force, but by a quiet act of kindness. And I had no idea how to rebuild the walls. My arm healed slowly. The deep throbbing ache was a constant reminder of my carelessness and of my debt to Ilara. She tended to the wound, daily cleaning and redressing it with a gentle competence that continued to unnerve me. Her touch was professional, distant, yet it sent a jolt through me every time her fingers brushed my skin. It was a reminder of a life I had long since buried, a life that had included tenderness and touch. During those days of forced inactivity, I had nothing to do but watch her. And as I watched, the mystery of her only deepened. I saw the way her eyes would sometimes drift to the snow-covered window, a haunted, faraway look in them. I saw how she would flinch at the sudden howl of a wolf or the crack of a falling, ice-laden branch. She was a woman living with ghosts, and their shadows were long and dark. The urge to ask, to break the silence with the clumsy hammer of my questions, was a constant battle. Who hurt you, Ilara? Who are the ghosts that haunt your eyes? What gods did you offend to be cast out into such a cruel world? The questions burned in my throat, but I swallowed them down. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that her story was not mine to take. It had to be given. One evening, about a fortnight after my accident, the dam of her silence finally broke. A blizzard had descended upon us again, a howling white fury that shook the very foundations of the cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow beat against the wooden shutters like 1,000 tiny fists. We were sealed in two souls, adrift in a sea of white. We sat by the fire, the storm a roaring beast just outside the walls. I was whittling a piece of scrap wood, my knife moving in slow, deliberate strokes. Alara was mending the tunic I had given her, her needle flashing in the firelight. The silence in the cabin was a fragile thing stretched taut against the violence of the storm. She spoke without looking up, her voice so low I almost didn't hear it over the wind. They called me a curse. I stopped whittling. My knife paused mid-stroke. I looked at her, but she kept her eyes fixed on her, sewing her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric. My people, she continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. When the winter came early and the deer moved on before the hunters were ready, the shaman said it was my fault, that I had brought a dark spirit into our camp. She paused, taking a shaky breath. My husband, he had died the spring before, a hunting accident. The shaman said it was no accident. He said I had wished it on him, that I had a darkness in my heart. He was a cruel man, my husband. He was not kind, but I did not wish for his death. The story came out in broken fragments, pieces of a shattered life. She spoke of the whispers that followed her, the suspicious glances, the way the other women would pull their children away as she passed. She spoke of the growing hunger in the camp, the desperation that made people cruel and superstitious. She was a convenient scapegoat, an easy target for their fear. One night, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, the men of my husband's family came to my lodge. They dragged me out into the snow. They said I was to be cast out, to take my darkness with me into the wilderness. They tore my clothes, took my furs. They left me with nothing. She finally looked up at me, and her eyes were two bottomless pools of pain. I begged. I told them I would die. They said it was the will of the spirits, that my death would appease them and bring the deer back. A cold, hard fury rose in me, a rage so intense it made my injured arm throb. I thought of the men who had done this to her, who had used their faith as a weapon and their strength as a tool of cowardice. I wanted to hunt them down. I wanted to make them feel a fraction of the terror and despair she must have felt. I walked for days, she said, her gaze returning to the fire. I don't know how many. I ate bark and snow. I followed the tracks of a rabbit, hoping it would lead me to food. It led me here, to your smokehouse. I knew the risk. I knew a white man would likely shoot me on sight, but I was already dead. I had nothing left to lose. She fell silent. The only sounds were the howling wind and the crackling fire. She had given me her story, a gift of trust so profound it left me breathless. She had shown me the raw, ugly wound of her past. I didn't know what to say. The usual words of comfort felt like cheap, hollow things in the face of such a monumental sorrow. I'm sorry was an insult to her suffering, so I said nothing. Instead, I rose from my chair, went to her, and knelt before her on the hearth. She flinched as I reached out, her body tensing. But I was slow, deliberate. I gently took the sewing from her hands and set it aside. Then I took her hands in mine. They were cold as ice. Your hands are cold, I said, my voice rough with emotion. I chafed them between my own, trying to bring some warmth back to them. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, silent and silver in the firelight. She didn't make a sound, but her whole body shook with a storm of grief that was more violent than the blizzard outside. I held her hands, anchoring her to the present, to the warmth of the fire, to the simple, solid fact of my presence. I didn't try to comfort her with lies. I didn't tell her it would be all right. I just knelt there, holding her hands, a silent witness to her pain. In that moment, something shifted between us irrevocably. She was no longer just a woman I had taken in. She was Alara, a woman who had been betrayed and abandoned, who had walked through the heart of a frozen hell and had somehow impossibly survived. And I, Silas, the man who had run from the world, who had walled himself up in a fortress of solitude, felt the last of my defenses crumble. I was no longer just her protector. I was her ally, her sanctuary. In the heart of that raging storm, two lonely, wounded souls found a fragile, unspoken alliance. The world could howl all it wanted. In this cabin, we would face it together. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning us in our small wooden world. But the atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. Alara's confession had been a storm of its own, and in its aftermath, the air was clearer, the silence between us less heavy. It was no longer a silence of caution, but of shared understanding. We had seen the deepest wounds of the other, her exile, my solitude, and we had not turned away. The physical distance between us began to shrink. We no longer moved around each other like wary animals. When we passed in the small space, our arms would sometimes brush. The first time it happened, we both froze, a jolt of electricity passing between us. But the contact was not unwelcome. It was a small anchor in the vast sea of our loneliness. In the evenings, she no longer retreated to her blanket on the floor immediately after our meal. She would sit by the fire and I would take my chair nearby. Sometimes she would tell me small things about her life before the way to find certain medicinal herbs, the stories her grandmother used to tell about the trickster coyote. I in turn found myself speaking of my life with Martha. I told her about the farm we had built together, about Martha's laugh, about the crushing silence she had left behind. I was speaking more in those few days than I had in 15 years. The words rusty from disuse came out slowly, haltingly, but Alara was a patient listener. She would watch me, her dark eyes filled with a deep, compassionate intelligence. She understood loss. She knew the language of grief. On the third night of the storm, the wind finally began to die down. The silence it left behind was profound, broken only by the steady crackle of the fire. We sat in our usual places, the warmth of the hearth a welcome comfort. Alara was staring into the flames, her face a beautiful, sad painting in the flickering light. I don't know what prompted me. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an impulse, a pull as strong and inevitable as gravity. I reached out and tucked a stray strand of her dark hair behind her ear. My fingers, rough and calloused, lingered for a moment against the impossible softness of her skin. She turned her head, her eyes meeting mine. The air grew thick, heavy. I could see the pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the few inches of space between us. I saw a question in her eyes and a fear, but also a flicker of something else. A longing that mirrored my own. I leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, to turn her head, to say no. But she didn't move. She held my gaze, her lips parting slightly. I closed the distance between us and pressed my mouth to hers. The kiss was not born of passion, but of a deeper, more powerful emotion. It was a kiss of gratitude, of solace, of recognition. It was a confirmation of everything that had passed between us without words. Her lips were soft, hesitant at first. Then they responded with a quiet, desperate intensity. Her hand came up to rest on my chest over my heart, and I could feel the tremor in her fingers. I pulled back, resting my forehead against hers. We stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, our eyes closed. The kiss had broken the last barrier between us. It was a promise made not in words, but in the simple, profound language of touch. When I finally moved back, I saw that tears were tracking silently down her face again. But these were not the tears of grief I had seen before. These were tears of release, of a tension that had been building in her for weeks, for months, for a lifetime. I gently wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. She leaned into my touch, a silent, trusting gesture that made my heart ache. "You don't have to sleep on the floor anymore," I said, my voice hoarse. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. I gestured toward my bed in the corner. It was a large bed built for two, though it had only held one for a very long time. "It's warmer," I said simply. "I'll take the floor." She shook her head, a small, definite motion. "No," she whispered. "I will share, if you will have me." The words, so simple, so direct, were a punch to the gut. If you will have me. After everything she had been through, she was still asking for permission to exist, to take up space. My jaw tightened. I stood up and pulled her gently to her feet. I led her to the bed and pulled back the heavy wool blankets. She climbed in her movements, graceful and hesitant. She lay on the very edge of the mattress, making herself as small as possible. I took off my boots and lay down beside her, leaving a respectable distance between us. I lay on my back, staring up at the dark ceiling, my heart hammering against my ribs. The mattress dipped under my weight, and I felt her tense beside me. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the dying crackle of the fire. I could feel the heat of her body across the small space between us. Finally, I felt her shift. She rolled toward me, her shoulder brushing against my arm. A moment later, I felt the light weight of her head on my chest. My arm moved of its own accord, wrapping around her, pulling her close. She sighed a soft, warm breath against my skin and seemed to melt against me. Her body, which had been so tense and coiled, finally relaxed. She was not a servant paying a debt. She was not a victim seeking a savior. She was a woman seeking warmth and safety in the arms of a man she had come to trust. I held her, my rough, calloused hand resting on the delicate bones of her back. The silence in the cabin was no longer an enemy. It was a blanket, a peaceful, shared quiet. For 15 years, this bed had been a cold, empty expanse, a monument to my loss. Tonight it was a sanctuary. As I drifted off to sleep with the weight of Alara in my arms and the sound of her steady breathing in my ears, I knew with a certainty that shook me to my core that I was no longer alone, and the fortress of my solitude had not been conquered. It had been liberated. The world thawed, and so did we. When the great snows of winter finally began to recede, giving way to the muddy, tentative beginnings of spring, a similar change occurred within the walls of the cabin. The harsh survivalist edge of our existence softened. The quiet between us was no longer born of caution, but of a deep, comfortable intimacy. Sharing a bed became the most natural thing in the world. Each night we would come together not with a feverish passion, but with a quiet, profound tenderness. It was a communion of two souls who had been starved of touch and affection for too long. In the darkness, with the embers of the fire glowing softly, we learned the topography of each other's bodies, the landscape of each other's scars, both visible and invisible. Her touch was a balm on the old aching wound of my loneliness. I hoped my touch was a confirmation for her, a testament that she was not a curse, but a woman worthy of being held, of being cherished. As the days grew longer, we worked side by side to prepare for the planting season. We cleared the small patch of land behind the cabin that served as my garden. The work was hard, turning the cold, heavy soil, but it was joyful work. I found myself humming a thing I hadn't done in 15 years. I would catch Alara watching me, a small, secret smile playing on her lips. I taught her how to read the soil, how to space the seeds which plants thrived in the thin mountain air. She was a quick learner, her hands, which had once been clumsy with my tools, now moving with a confident grace. She had a connection to the earth that I, for all my years of solitary labor, had never quite managed. She seemed to listen to it, to understand its rhythms in a way I never could. One afternoon, as we knelt together in the dark, rich earth, pressing bean seeds into a shallow furrow, she paused, sitting back on her heels. She looked at the garden, then at the cabin, then at the vast greening expanse of the mountains around us. "The first time I saw this place," she said, her voice soft, "I thought it was the end of my life. I thought I would either die in the snow or be killed for stealing." She looked at me, her eyes clear and steady. I never imagined I would be planting a new life here. I reached out and took her hand, my fingers lacing through hers. Her palm was calloused now, like mine, stained with the same good earth. "This is your home, Alara," I said, the words feeling more true than anything I had ever spoken. "You belong here, not because you have nowhere else to go," I added, my grip tightening slightly, "but because you choose to." A tear slipped from her eye, but this time she was smiling. It was the first real, unburdened smile I had ever seen from her, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long, hard winter. It transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. That smile became a more common sight as the spring deepened into a lush, vibrant summer. Life returned to the mountains, and it returned to us. We worked, we ate, we slept. But now our lives were intertwined, our routines a shared dance. The cabin, once a monument to my solitude, was now filled with the sounds of her soft singing, as she worked with the smell of the wildflowers she would pick and place in a jar on the table, with the simple, profound warmth of her presence. I learned that her quietness was not timidity, but a deep, observant wisdom. I learned that beneath her gentle exterior was a will of iron, a spirit that could not be broken. She in turn learned my moods, my habits, the unspoken language of my heart. She knew when I needed silence, and when I needed the simple comfort of her hand on my arm. We never spoke of the future. We didn't need to. The future was in the seeds we planted, in the wood we stacked for the next winter, in the way we moved together as one. The past, with all its ghosts and sorrows, had not been erased, but it no longer had the power to haunt us. Our shared present was too strong, too vibrant. One evening in late summer, we sat on the small porch I had built, watching the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. A comfortable silence settled between us as we watched the day die. Alara leaned her head against my shoulder. "Silas," she whispered. Do you ever miss it?" The silence, I thought for a moment, remembering the crushing weight of the absolute quiet, the hollow echo of my own footsteps, the lonely howl of the wind. I remembered the man I had been, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. I tightened my arm around her, pulling her closer. "No," I said, my voice thick with a truth that was as solid and real as the mountains around us. "This is not silence anymore. This is peace. And it was. The hungry Apache woman who had stumbled into my life out of the heart of a winter storm had not been a curse. She had been a blessing. She had not served me in the way she had offered in her desperation. She had saved me. She had led me out of the frozen wilderness of my own heart and into the warmth of a life I had thought was lost to me forever. In a world of noise and chaos, we had found our own quiet sanctuary, a silent, beautiful peace built not on solitude, but on the simple, miraculous foundation of a shared life. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.